the historians have to take Geoffrey at his word, where he talks about another man named Constantine, who takes the army to defend the island. He seems to be the cry for help goes out, and Constantine answers the call, and he is aided by the Britons, and he is crowned at Silchester. And he had 3 sons: Constans, Aurelius, Ambrosius, and Uther. Now they all come of age in the 5th century, but there seems to be no more Roman connection. So these are the 3 men that I guess we have to look at with some skepticism as historians, eh?
Yeah, Ambrosius Aurelianus does turn up in Bede, I think. And Bede is a comparatively respectable historian. So there is some evidence that there was a patrician connection, and there was a tradition that lasted at least through to the end of the 5th century, perhaps.
And Ambrosius is a name that seems to have great importance within the British legend and folklore.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sometimes argued that Arthur and Ambrosius are the same person, that it was perhaps Arthur was a nickname or something for this man. Because Ambrosius Aurelianus does seem to have been, in a later tradition, the main leader. It is interesting that Nennius, I think, in the later Welsh chronicler, says that Arthur was not king. He says he calls him the leader of the battles, the Dux Bellorum. He refers to kings, but he says, and there was the resistance led by the kings of Britain and Arthur, the leader of the battles, as if suggesting he is a general, not himself a ruler. Now that's, again, we're talking about 300 years later. This is a tradition, but that might explain why there's a distinction between Ambrosius Aurelianus and Arthur.
But an important distinction, because to make him a king would cast him in an entirely different light from our perspective. Whereas as a general, many great generals have probably been lost to history, but kings we always seem to preserve their...
And you could understand how a later tradition would make him a king. I mean, if he survived as a legend amongst the Celtic people, then it's quite easy to see how eventually he would become a king, even if he had originally just been a general. As I said earlier, there does seem to be a strong connection between the British Celts and the Celts in Brittany. And this lasts right the way through until the 12th century. You're still getting stories going backwards and forwards between the 2 communities. And one of the literary forms in which Arthurian stories are preserved in the later Middle Ages is a thing called the Breton lay, which there are many in French, but a handful in English. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote one, in fact. But it does seem to be that stories from the island crossed the Channel and were turned into a sort of literary form in Brittany, then to the French court, and then back to England in this curious kind of circular pattern. So I think that it's not incredible that there should be this kind of interchange between Brittany and Wales.
Geoffrey brings in the figure of Merlin. He gives a complete history for the man, very strange, that he's the product of a virgin birth, and very mysterious figure who has these prophecies. He knows of these prophecies that tell of the boar of Cornwall, who will come and save the people.
I suspect people were readier to believe magic in the 12th century than we would be now. I think they would be less skeptical. That's not to say that some people were not skeptical, some were. I mean, there were people even in the 12th and 13th century who doubted the historicity of Arthur. But I think the audience would have enjoyed and been not entirely skeptical about the magical details.
So Uther reigns for better than 15 years, and then he's poisoned like everyone else. And then Arthur he has his coronation at Silchester. He is young but ambitious, and he is aided immediately by the Pictish and the Scots. And then he talks about 3 battles at River Douglas, Lincoln, and Culloden Wood. Already he's using his sword Caliburn, which comes from Avalon, and he uses a shield with the picture of the Virgin Mary.
Right, that goes back, we do know that goes back a bit. That's in Nennius. So there is evidence before Geoffrey of Monmouth for this shield with the picture of the Virgin Mary on it. I mean, it still doesn't take us back anything like to Arthur's own historical period, but I mean, there is one example of something that clearly Geoffrey is not making up, that he's got from somewhere else.
And he also mentions that Arthur is intent on rebuilding the churches, and restoring the rights of the landowners, and encouraging the ideals of courage and generosity, Christian charity. And then he marries Guinevere, who is of Roman descent. So there again, there are these links.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It is, as I say, it's impossible to know really how much of this is history and how much is. I mean, it's entirely credible that there was a Welsh chronicle going back to the 7th or even the 6th century that we now no longer have, that Geoffrey had access to. It's entirely possible.
But it's interesting to see how the changes that were made to Geoffrey by subsequent writers of Arthurian legend, how they sort of take some of these ideas and go off in different directions with them. But using him as our prime source for Arthurian legend, we see the main points: the use of the sword from Avalon, Guinevere,
Mordred, of course. Mordred, I mean, the death by treachery, which is important in all versions of Arthur. I think that he's betrayed, that otherwise this great leader could never have succumbed had it not been for being betrayed.
Geoffrey also says that Arthur invaded and conquered Ireland, which seems improbable. We don't have historical evidence of this.
No. Although there was, of course, at an earlier period, considerable amount of movement across the Irish Sea, particularly between the Picts and the Irish, southern lowland Scotland and Ireland, frequent migrations, I think, so that the story may be a sort of dim folk memory of something like that.
Unless it was a friendly invasion.
Yeah, maybe, although they weren't always friendly, of course. But
well, he increases his personal entourage with distinguished men from far distant kingdoms. So we see the court beginning to take shape, and it's composed of men not just from his own people, but it seems to be from all over.
And this of course may be an attempt to show Arthur in the same sort of light as Henry II. I mean, Henry II was an international monarch with possessions in France, I say, and with courtiers from all over, including, of course, Geoffrey himself being brought to the court from Wales. So he may be portraying Arthur in the sort of image of his own patron.
There's a code of courtliness, and then there is this idea of Europe as a place to conquer. This seems to be his goal in Geoffrey's account. He conquers Norway and Denmark, and then he confronts Frollo. There's the Gallic conquests. Bedivere is in Normandy, is entrusted with. We see some of these figures that we will get to know them better in other accounts. But we see Bedivere and Kay, who is given Anjou, and then the Roman garrison town of Caerleon. Am I pronouncing that correctly? So this is probably Camelot, eh?
Well, gosh, Camelot is a mystery. Caerleon, the city of the legions, I think is what that means in Welsh, is usually thought to be Carlisle in the northwest of England. But Camelot, there are a dozen different sites proposed for Camelot. The most recent, I think, was a place called Cadbury, which is fairly close to Glastonbury, which of course is a centre of Arthurian story. And was excavated quite recently, and certainly showed some renaissance at the period we would want to see Camelot, i.e. the late 5th, early 6th century. There does seem to have been signs that the fortifications were renewed and so on. But the trouble is that archaeology is largely dumb. I mean, unless you actually dig up something with Camelot scraped on it, sort of scratched on a piece of pottery or something, then you can't prove it, and you can merely say that this is a likely contender.
But obviously, we know, I mean, to spend the money on archaeological digs would indicate that there is a great deal of interest.
Oh, sure.
There has been for some time in finding out more about Arthur.
Yeah, and I think the archaeologists, it's not something I know much about, but I think the archaeologists have, in fact, revealed a great deal about this period. I think we know a great deal more than we did about the way in which the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons proceeded. We know the sort of, we can date sort of settlements and the overrunning of settlements and so on from archaeological evidence much better than we could, even 50 years ago.
So it's safe to say that there's a very serious attempt being made by the scholarly community, by archaeology and historians, to verify some of the information that we once thought was legendary.
I think so, yeah, and I think it's comparatively recent, this switch from, in the old days, archaeology was only respectable if you were looking at the Greeks and the Romans, and most British archaeology was unearthing Roman fortresses. But I think in say, the last 50 years or so, there's been an interest in medieval and Dark Age archaeology, and it's revealed a great deal, of course.
So we mentioned Modred being the nephew of Arthur, being left in charge at home while Arthur is taking on this big goal of he's taking the offensive in Gaul, and he's left the kingdom in the hands of Modred while he conquers Europe. And his other nephew, Gawain, who plays an impressive part in the battles versus the Romans. Here we have one more encounter with the Romans, where the Romans expect Arthur to pay tribute to them, and he tells them to take a hike, and then he beats them.
Right.
So Geoffrey wants to show that Arthur is even triumphant over the once mighty Romans.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it certainly is possible to construct a scenario for a kind of crumbling Roman Empire with various pretenders to the power of Rome, claiming tribute and so on, and Arthur being one of those who for a while is successful even on the continent. I mean, it's perfectly possible to see that as a historical reality.
But while Arthur is away fighting this war, Modred forges an alliance with Guinevere, an adulterous relationship, which and Modred betrays Arthur and allies himself with the Saxons, and then Arthur has to go back home and fight the ultimate battle with his own people.
Right. Geoffrey Ashe, in the article I was mentioning, argues that these continental saints' lives suggest that Arthur was killed on the continent. Or at least that a British leader who came across to France got involved in local wars in France in the period of the breakup of the sort of Gallo-Roman Empire, and that this British leader was killed fighting in France. The attraction of that, of course, is the old story of the mystery of Arthur's death and the mystery of his burial, where the remains of Arthur are to be found, and the story that Arthur may return someday, that again is very persistent in later legend. That might be consistent with a historical Arthur who actually died abroad, who at the height of his power disappeared.